Hello, guys. Welcome to Conversations with Elizabeth Johnston. I'm Elizabeth, and I am super excited about our podcast today. We are going to be talking about fighting human trafficking with an amazing guest. Human trafficking has almost become a trendy buzzword that has lost its significance. And although I'm glad it's trendy to fight modern day slavery that's happening right under our noses, I do hope in this episode to remove some of the misunderstandings surrounding human trafficking and reignite your urgency on this issue, because it's just not enough for us to make an annual post about human trafficking and virtue signal about it. And my guest today has done a lot more than that. She has made human trafficking her life's work, and her name is Anne Basham. Anne is the mother of 3 children, a Christian, and the CEO of Anti-Trafficking International. Anne was the senior advisor at the Department of Justice Office for Victims of Crime, the largest federal funder of anti-human trafficking efforts in the United States. She's got a master's degree from the University of Virginia, and she's dedicated her personal and professional life to helping stop violence against women, children, and human trafficking. Anne, welcome to the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
Awesome. I cannot wait for this conversation. Would you please tell the listeners and the viewers how you got involved in fighting human trafficking?
That's a great question. So I first heard of the epidemic of human trafficking probably about 15 years ago. But really, for me, it started a long time before that. I grew up in a family, to give them credit, that really, we call it social justice issues now, but they didn't just talk about social justice issues. They really believed in action. They really believed in doing something about it. So even when I was a child, for example, my parents were foster parents. My mom had
Mm.
3 kids. My dad had a busy job, but they really felt like we need to do something about this. So we had foster kids that ranged from infants to teenagers and in our home. And our home really
Wow.
was a refuge for kids in crisis. So I think from an early age, it was just really ingrained in me that you really need to do something and that kids matter.
Wow. That's amazing. Your parents sound really amazing. I'd love to meet them. So I ran across this horrifying statistic, and it said that 60% of child sex trafficking victims recovered through FBI raids across the U.S. in 2013 were from foster care or group homes. Is this true? 60% of child sex trafficking victims are from foster homes? And if so, are CPS workers actually involved in the crime of human trafficking of foster children?
That's a really great question. First of all, the statistic is true. It's been widely proven and used over the years. But I will say this, the role of CPS, which is Child Protective Services, is they are really the gatekeeper to the foster care system. So before a child even ends up in foster care, they have to go through the state version of CPS, whatever that's called in that state. So they really are the gatekeeper, and what happens really stops with them. The short answer to your question is, while I know many CPS caseworkers and believe that many, if not most of them, are wonderful people with doing this for all the right motives, when you are in an industry where there are children, you are going to have predators. That's just a known thing. If you go in the
Mhm.
ocean and you want to see dolphins, you will get a few sharks. And that is the nature. And so, yes, there have been cases of CPS workers who are involved in trafficking. One of the most recent cases of that was actually in January, I believe it was January of 2020 in New Jersey. But I will tell you, our organization is actually, excuse me, currently working with a case in another state, not going to say which state, but it's not Virginia. And terrible case. A girl was contacted us. She's 29 years old now, but she was put into foster care at the age of 2 or 3. Then she was eventually adopted by this gentleman, and she became pregnant. And this is all true, pregnant at the age of 10 years old with
Ugh.
triplets. This has been verified by medical
Pregnant
records.
with triplets at the age of,
Yes, and gave birth.
at
And
the
those
age of what?
10,
Oh
10.
my word.
And those triplets are, of course, now 19 years old, all been verified with, uh, medical records. And this gentleman was allowed to adopt not only her, but to bring multiple children into his home through foster care.
Oh
And
my
they
word.
and she was eventually trafficked. So as she got into the prime, what we call the prime target age for most trafficking victims, which is really 11 to 15, he would sell her out for money. And so
Mm.
this happened not only to her, but to others. And we do have evidence that there were people, of course, within CPS who did know about it, don't know the motives, not that involved in that part of the case. But yes, unfortunately, this does happen there as well.
I mean, I God built me to be a justice warrior, and so this stuff like seriously burns me up. And I'm really glad that we are able to shed light on this and expose this in this interview today. The Bible says in Psalm 82, defend the cause of the weak and fatherless, maintain the rights of the poor and oppressed, rescue the weak and needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. As believers, this is our mission. And this should really concern us that children are being exploited in this way right under our noses. And this is not some conspiracy. Psychology Today just put out an article this week, Psychology Today by Mitzi Perdue, titled Make Foster Care Rare and Brief. Children in foster care can be particularly vulnerable to sex trafficking. That was the subtitle of Miss Perdue's article in Psychology Today. Guys, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is a legit news story, and I'm really happy that we today are able to shed light on this. Tell me, Anne, why aren't foster parents and CPS workers being prosecuted for these crimes, or are they, and we're just not hearing about it in the media?
Well, sometimes they are. I mean, the case in New Jersey, the woman was prosecuted. I think the biggest thing is actually fear. So people have a fear of reporting. It's
Mm,
scary to report. I mean, think about it. First of all, sometimes you're not totally sure that you see what you see, you suspect something. What I often hear is, I'm afraid to report because I'm afraid I would be wrong. What will
mm,
happen if I'm wrong? And then, of course, the fear of retaliation. That's a very real fear. Am I going to lose my job? Are they going to come after me in some other way? All these fears. So I think fear is the number one reason why people don't report. I also think with that, there is an element of lack of training. So I will
mm.
say, we actually here at our organization, interestingly, we are in the prevention space. So we actually train CPS workers. We actually train APS, CPS,
Wow.
social services to recognize the signs of human trafficking and then to know what to do about it. And that's why I said, I think for most people, they really want to recognize the signs.
Hmm.
There's a lack of knowledge, and there's a verse in the Bible that says, for lack of knowledge, the people perish. And I'm
Yeah.
paraphrasing, I'm probably not getting every word correct, but that's true. And the flip side is true as well. When you know better, you do better. And so that's why I feel one of the biggest barriers to not only prosecution, but just turning people in is simply lack of knowledge, that they don't really see the signs, because the signs of human trafficking are definitely a little bit different sometimes than the signs of traditional abuse or neglect.
That's good, Anne. And your organization, Anti-Human Trafficking, is doing great work. Tell our listeners what website to go to connect with you there.
Yeah, so they can just go to preventht.org. You can just send us a message and we'll get you hooked up with training.
preventht.org.
You got it.
Great. So now, there are always misguided individuals out there that will sometimes babble on about how human trafficking is not really a major problem and that it's just nothing more than prostitution. So, could you please distinguish between prostitution and sex trafficking?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. So there is a big difference between prostitution and sex trafficking, or we call it, commercial sex work. Um, so sex trafficking really involves force, fraud, or coercion. That's when you know something has crossed the line into trafficking. It's no longer voluntary. It's no longer of someone's own volition, but they are being forced. They are being coerced in some way. And that is why it's then trafficking.
Right. And give me an example of what that coercion might look like.
Yeah. So
Let's delve into the life of a girl that's being coerced.
absolutely. So one of the things that we see actually this happens with high schoolers, and this is going to be pretty shocking to people.
Mm,
So this whole topic is very shocking, I know, to a lot of people.
hmm
So one example, and this is a real life example, is a high school student. She is comes from an upper socioeconomic family, intact family. Both parents are in the home, loving home, happened to be blonde hair, blue eyed. And she had a boyfriend, and her boyfriend was what they thought was this wonderful, wonderful man.
mm,
And it turns out he was a recruiter. And a recruiter is someone who, think of it in terms of drugs. So it used to be, we always know drugs because why do people sell drugs? Well, it's for money. Same thing with trafficking. Only with trafficking, you can make a whole lot more money because you don't sell that product once. You can sell that product up to 40 times a day,
mm.
because the product is a person. And so who's the prime target? The prime target is really that demographic of 11 to 15 up to 18. And really what the recruiter does, who's often a boyfriend in a high school, is he will lure that girl into either having sex with him, and he will videotape it.
Mm.
So if he videotapes it, then he uses that videotape as coercion and says, hey, listen, I'm going to put this on the internet and everyone's going to see it unless you fill in the blank. Basically gets her to go become and traffics her, sometimes on school grounds, after school, brings in multiple, buyers. So that's how the coercion can work. It can also work in terms of fear. So if they're not videotaped, for example, they could threaten their parents, say, I'm going to come and harm your parents. I'm going to harm your family. I'm going to, destroy your reputation. All of those things come into play. And so that's really where coercion comes in, is really threatening them with fear of some sort, fear of their reputation, or
Wow.
fear of physical harm to them or their family.
So the videotape coercion is a big part of the movement.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And it's something I think most parents in particular, we can't even imagine it. I used to think back in the day, like, oh, it's just kidnapping off my front lawn. But most trafficking is not kidnapping off your front lawn. Trafficking is luring. It's all about being groomed and lured, and very slowly and methodically over time, really honestly getting the victim to willingly participate to a degree. But there is that element, like I said, of forced fraud, or
Wow.
versus straight, what we would call prostitution, which
Yeah.
is where the person at any time can leave, can choose to stop that line of work, and there really is no ramification for them. They can just walk away. With
Yeah.
trafficking, they can't just walk away.
This reminds me of the story that finally came out about what was the name of the group that worked through videotape coercion, the actors in Hollywood were involved in? Do you remember the name of that group?
No.
Yeah, it's become a major media story because the guy who led the group got outed and actually went to trial and got convicted. Um,
You're talking, yes, 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 with yes, and it involved Hollywood actors.
yes,
Yes, I don't remember
yes. I
names,
can't
but yeah.
remember the name either, but that's exactly how they functioned, through videotape coercion. So that's a major part of the story. Um, okay, so I also read that more than 60% of trafficked individuals are moved by their handlers through airports. And that was really interesting to me. And tell us, as citizens who fly in airports, what we need to be looking for to help rescue trafficking victims.
Yeah. So fortunately, now that COVID is ending, the airports are getting busier. We're all getting out there to be able to fly. And really, this is one of my favorite things to teach people about, because it's something anyone can recognize. So we
Okay.
all have the eyes and the ears. So think of the word dear, DEAR. So what you want to remember is D stands for dress, E stands for energy, A stands for age and R stands for relationship. So those are the things, and I'm going to go through them real briefly. So dress, what is she dressed like? And it's usually a female. So oftentimes, one classic scenario, she'll be in sweatpants, but her nails will look nice, her hair will look nice, those sort of things. The other thing is that she may look sleep deprived. She may look malnourished. They're usually not very well. So that's there. Those can be, as far as their energy goes, I will tell you, they usually don't have a lot of energy. They avoid eye contact. Those are some of the signs that you want to look for as well. Their age. Okay, so these will be usually girls between the ages, like I said, 11, probably into their early 20s. So that's really the age that you're looking for. But it's not just the age, it's the age of the person they're with. So is the person they're with significantly older? And by the way, it might be a female. It's not always a man. It definitely can be a female.
The handlers are sometimes females.
Absolutely. They could definitely be a female. And sometimes the girls are together. So you might see two teenage girls together. That can sometimes be a flag too. It's two teenage girls with one older man. And then the last sign is the relationship. And for me, this is the most important. This is a sign, just as a mom, I think that we would all notice. You kind of all the relationship element of it. So if you see this, there's no warm and fuzzy going on. They're not going to be warm and fuzzy with the person that this isn't someone who's their father, and they're not going to treat him like their father or their mother.
Right.
There might be elements of fear there. They might be nervous around security. That could be another element. But you can just tell in that relationship that it's not quite there. Usually, your chance to observe them would be inside. Outside, you might even see them be dropped off, because there's sometimes even a separation between them. Yeah.
Have you ever seen a trafficking victim in an airport, do you think?
So there were a couple times I thought I might have, but I have a really great story. Actually, the founder of our organization, and I'll tell his story, he doesn't mind it. Back in December, we were actually with the Department of Justice and on a business trip, and he had left the next morning. And when he got there, was sitting, waiting to get on his flight, and saw what was clearly trafficking victims. Two girls dressed in sweats. Their hair looked good, their nails looked good, teenagers, and with an older man, and the relationship was clearly not a father. So he waited. He waited to see, first of all, what the flight attendants would do, because on this particular airline, these flight attendants should have had training. They talk about how they've had training. No one on the flight crew noticed. They went all the way through. They'd not only gone through security, but they boarded the plane. They'd all taken their seats. And finally, he had to actually alert them. He had to say to a flight attendant, hey, basically, I don't mean to wreck your day, but I'm going to have to tell you that there are some trafficking victims on here. And he had to explain to her the signs of why this was probably a trafficking case. And sure enough, they called security. They were in flight, so they called airport police here in Washington, D.C., which is where they were flying into. They were able to interdict the group when they got off, and it was trafficking. It was a confirmed case of trafficking. But who knows how many times that happens, or how many times you might see that in an airport or in a bathroom.
Wow, fascinating. And tell me, why are the victims so young? Why not women in their 20s, 30s?
Well, there are victims in their 20s. That's definitely true, but it usually is under the age of 25. And I would personally attribute that. I think the facts are there to pornography and the rise in just the consumption of online pornography. And it's kind of a, what do we consume? And that's what we want. And most pornography, frankly, involves younger and younger demographics. So it involves, honestly, more and more of that demographic. And I think that's why it's more of an output, and oftentimes, of pornography versus being just a standalone factor.
So you're saying that's the appetite that's been created for those that are wanting to consume it?
Absolutely.
Okay. I see. So I think that it is easy for us to assume as Christian parents that our children could not possibly get trapped in a situation like this. But I really think that that is a head buried in the sand mentality that we need to combat. Does human trafficking hit closer to home than we might think? I mean, who else other than foster children that you've mentioned statistically are targeted. Who else is targeted for human trafficking?
Well, the scary fact is anyone can be. So there's not one demographic that's going to be immune to this, not one. So children who have special needs are especially vulnerable because, you know, they're weaker in different ways. The other category is honestly higher socioeconomic classes and girls who are, just if I can be blunt, like white girls between the ages of 11 and 15. Like
That's
they go for top
crazy.
dollar. Yeah, and they're considered naive. I mean, there's lots of reasons they go for top dollar, but they're also considered naive and frankly easier pickings. So I know a lot of parents feel, oh, it happens somewhere else or it must happen in a certain type of neighborhood. But the truth is it happens all around the country and in probably every county in the country.
Wow.
Yeah.
So my audience is filled with, concerned parents and grandparents. That's the audience that we have built here. And they're going to want action items after listening to some of the horrifying things that have been shared here in this powerful interview. So what are some good action items, Anne, as we're closing up here? How do we educate and insulate our children from predators and sex traffickers?
So I could give a huge laundry list of what to do. I think the very first thing is to get educated. So you can actually go to our website. There's a parenting resource center. I'm hugely supportive of parents having the tools because I think we are the best teachers of our own children and we really should be the people with the most influence. So there's a free tool guide that you can actually download right from our website for parents. But the second thing I would say is honestly just have the conversation. I can't tell you how many times that I talk to parents and it's difficult to talk about sex. Like who wants to sit there and talk about sex with your kids? But we really need to. We really need to talk about these things. From my perspective, it's like crossing the street. When your kids are little, you don't just cross the street with them. You teach them to cross the street. You say, okay, here's the deal. You stand at here, you look both ways before you cross the street. And this is why, because we don't want a car to hit you. Well, it's the same thing. We have to stand there with our child and actually say, listen, I don't want you to get hit by this. When you see this, I really want you to recognize it because 1 in 5 children will be approached by a trafficker, 1 in 5. And that's a very, very high statistic. In fact, specifically online, if I can just go there for a second, online, that's one of the biggest vulnerabilities. It's not just physical in-person trafficking, but really online exploitation. So during 2020, actually, let me look at the statistic. During 2020, 21.7 million reports came in to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. 21.7 million reported child sexual exploitation cases. So that's just huge. I mean, record breaking during the pandemic. So traffickers are after our kids in our homes. And I don't work for this organization. I know you've mentioned them as well, so I'm going to mention them, but Bark, if you're looking for just a really simple way to protect your kids online, to protect those devices, you just get Bark. Like I said, I'm not being paid to do this,
Yes.
but it's a really simple thing to do. The other thing that parents can do is they can really just start the conversation with their kids. Just sit down and have that conversation. So my own daughter is in 6th grade and our curriculum is actually in the school system here in Fairfax County. So the curriculum for my organization is actually, they have an anti-trafficking curriculum in there.
Wow.
So she this curriculum, last week, and she came home, and in 6th grade, it starts with very simple topics. What is abuse? They don't get into trafficking and grooming in 6th grade, but it really started with those concepts of, what is abuse? What is sexual harassment? What is all this like? And she came home, and to her, frankly, it was stuff she'd heard before. It was like nothing new. And she said, Mom, I couldn't believe it. All these kids in the class, they were shocked. She said, one girl looked at me and said, I'm scared. This is scary stuff, because she'd never heard it before. They had never heard this information. So I just would encourage parents, instead of worrying that you're not going to say it right or worrying that it's uncomfortable, just have that conversation, just open that door. And then the last thing I'd say on that is really be open to letting your kids talk. and they may tell you some very shocking things. I
Whoa.
cannot tell you how many times I've heard parents just be shocked at what their children eventually tell them. So just brace yourself for the fact to try not to look shocked. I certainly have, at times when my kids have, told me things they're thinking, but I think I would rather,
Okay.
like, I'd like to know what my kids are thinking or seeing. And really, in that, so the very, very last thing I want to share on that is really training your own children to be their own best governor. So what I mean by that is,
Yeah.
we're not going to be there forever. We're
Nope.
not with our children all the time. I can't sit there and helicopter parent my children. I just can't. And really, my goal is that I'm raising a child who will get out there and understand what the limits are and why those limits are there. Not just, hey, Johnny, don't consume this and don't look at this, but why? Like,
Yeah.
why shouldn't we do that? And that's where you really have a chance to talk about your values, to talk about what it does to the brain, which
Mm.
is a conversation for another day, but really get it back to, hey, not just this is mom's rule or this is dad's rule, but this should be your rule for yourself, for your
Mm.
own benefit. And here's why. Because then you have kids who literally police themselves and honestly police their siblings too, which I love. you know,
Yeah.
they'll if they see their siblings doing something because they've been trained to, train themselves.
That all of the advice you just gave is so good, and I'm just inspired by it on a personal level. I'm seeing myself having conversations right now that I need to have. I need to make sure. I've got a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 7-year-old. And the younger they are, the easier it is to take advantage of them, and for them to just in innocent ignorance get involved in a situation that you never dreamed your child could be duped into being involved in. And so I'm really inspired by this. And I would just like to ask you if in like 60 seconds you could say what you might say to a 9-year-old or an 11-year-old, not about pornography, because I feel like that's a conversation that parents are probably having with their children. The conversation I'm concerned that parents are not having with their children, Anne, is predators hitting the child up on the internet, because we aren't necessarily, I don't play video games, for instance. There's a world out there that I'm not connected with, even though I'm very connected online with social media and whatnot. There are some things that I wouldn't even know to say. I wouldn't even know to warn my child because I'm not involved in those activities online. Could you take 60 seconds and tell me what you might say to, a 9-year-old about that conversation?
Yeah, so what I've said to my kids, even when they play Roblox, which is supposed to have all these, special things in place to prevent, I've said to them, if anyone tries to have a conversation with you, you really need to disengage. That's
Mm.
it, number one. The second thing I say to people, I would say to children in general and to have parents say to their children, is this concept of stranger danger. It's often not a stranger. It's someone who tries to make themselves seem like your friend. And so really developing relationships online at all with people that you don't know should not happen.
It's a
And
no-go.
it's a no-go. And you
Mm-hmm.
don't give out personal information. That's the third thing. You never give out personal information, not your name, not your address, not your phone number, not your parents' name, nothing. You don't take pictures and send them, just no personal information to anyone online.
So good. I know what conversation we're having tomorrow morning for devotions at my house, family devotions. I am really inspired by this, and tens of thousands of people are going to listen to this, watch this, and they're going to make changes in their own homes. I'm going to make sure that I place links in the caption and in the comments section that are going to help you guys, things that Anne has referred to here. I just want to thank you, Anne, so much for taking your time, for coming on, and for equipping us to be better parents and grandparents and to keep our kids safe. Thank you so much, and God bless you.
Thank you so much for having me.